Hey guys, tonight we drift into a story that begins with color of all things, one of the slipperiest and most elusive aspects of the world. Imagine the sky at twilight when the sun has just dropped behind the horizon and the sea stretches out like a mirror that refuses to settle on one shade. Blue bleeds into black. A streak of pink lingers, and then there's that odd, almost mystical band of deep violet that makes you squint and wonder, was that really purple or just your tired eyes playing tricks? Humans have always been obsessed with what they cannot quite hold, and purple, real purple, was once the rarest catch of all. You probably won't survive this era I'm about to walk you through, not just because of the lack of electricity, plumbing and Netflix, but because the smell alone would drive you out of town before dinner. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you. I love seeing how these late night rambles connect people scattered across time zones. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're standing on a rocky coast of the Eastern Mediterranean. It's the 2nd millennium BCE, give or take a few centuries. The waves lap gently against stone piers, gulls wheel overhead, and you tug your cloak tighter because the breeze is salty damp and full of the aromas of fish tar and smoke from distant cook fires. This is Phoenician land, a ribbon of coastal cities strung like beads along the sea. Tyre Sidon Byblos, names that sound like whispers carried by the surf. Small in size, these cities punch far above their weight because they know the sea better than almost anyone alive at this time. They are sailors, traders, builders of ships that cut across the waves like arrows. But beneath all that maritime glory lies a peculiar secret. The Phoenicians stumble on a way to turn the slimy contents of little sea snails into a dye so rich, so hard to make, and so long-lasting that entire kingdoms will measure their prestige by it. You glance down at your hands, your fingernails chipped and blackened from hauling ropes. The people around you aren't thinking about fashion shows or regal catwalks. They're simply trying to wring value from every corner of their rocky, resource-starved homeland. The forests are thin, the soil poor. But the sea, the sea, teems with hidden treasures, some with shells that glitter in the shallows, others lurking deeper, waiting to be pried loose. The funny thing is, if you scoop up one of these little mollusks right now and squint at it, there's nothing majestic about it. It's slimy, stubborn, and looks like it belongs in a soup pot, not in a palace. Historians still argue whether the Phoenicians discovered purple dye by accident, perhaps noticing that crushed snails left strange stains on their clothes, or whether it was a deliberate, smelly experiment. Either way, the discovery changes their destiny. Close your eyes for a moment and picture cloth before this age of miracle colors. Most fabrics are off-white beige, or if you're lucky, tinted with vegetable dyes that fade as quickly as the morning dew. Greens from plants, yellows from saffron, browns from bark. Pretty enough, but nothing that screams bow down before me. And then there's purple, deep, regal, impossible purple. Not the washed-out lavender of your grandmother's curtains, but a shade that looks like it's swallowed sunlight and decided to live forever. That's what the Phoenicians coax out of their snails, though it takes mountains of shells and weeks of foul-smelling labor to get even a handful of dyed threads. You can almost hear the first merchants muttering to themselves, "No one will pay for this. It stinks worse than low tide," but they underestimate human vanity. Kings, queens, priests, anyone desperate to stand apart suddenly cannot live without it. And so the story of Tyrian purple begins not with luxury, but with disgust, not with wealth, but with waste. As you linger in the twilight of this ancient harbor, you sense the paradox. This color born from rot and stench will become the very badge of holiness, power, and eternity. You might think of it as the first luxury brand, an early Louis Vuitton, but gooier. The Phoenicians don't have logos, but they have purple. And purple alone says, this fabric costs more than your house. And so you breathe in the salty night, half nauseated, half intrigued. Tomorrow, when the baskets of snails arrive and the workers crack shells open to begin their gruesome work, you'll see the first step in a process that reshapes ancient economies. But for now, under the fading light, you realize you've stumbled into a story where color is destiny and slime is treasure. The sun is up and you shuffle barefoot along rough wooden planks that creak under the weight of sailors unloading their morning catch. Not fish, this time, but bundles of timber jars of oil and amphorae clinking with wine. The Phoenician harbor is alive with a chaos that feels almost musical, each note played by a different trade. You can hear the pounding of hammers on ship hulls, the crack of ropes tightening against mooring posts, and somewhere nearby the splash of children daring one another to leap into the water where the smaller boats rest. The Phoenicians? These Canaanite folk, as outsiders sometimes call them, are not a single kingdom, but a necklace of fiercely independent city-states. Tyre and Sidon shine brightest their names, echoing through the marketplace chatter. From these ports, ships fan out across the Mediterranean carrying cedar wood-carved ivory, glass beads that shimmer like frozen starlight, and of course the promise of purple dye. If you step closer to a trader, you notice his cloak is patched but serviceable, and hanging from his belt is a string of curious amulets, shells, bronze trinkets, maybe even a bead of lapis that must have come all the way from Mesopotamia. The architecture around you is simple, yet enduring stone foundations topped with sun-baked bricks, flat roofs where herbs dry in the breeze, and narrow alleys that twist like mazes between walls. Every doorway seems to hold a story, families grinding grain-weaving cloth or mending nets. There's a rhythm here, a daily grind that somehow supports the vast web of trade stretching from Cyprus to Spain. You pause at a bakery where the smell of flatbread mixes with the salty tang of the harbor, and you can't help but smirk. Even 3,000 years ago, someone probably burned the bread and blamed the oven. The harbor isn't just about goods, though. It's about stories carried on the tides. Sailors bring gossip of Egyptian pharaohs demanding more cedar for their temples, or rumors of strange people in the West who worship bulls and build labyrinths. One merchant brags that his cousin saw a shipwreck where amphorae of oil floated like bobbing lanterns across the sea. Another swears he glimpsed a sea monster, though you suspect it was just too much wine. And here, amid the din, are the snails. Piled into baskets, their shells glisten in the sun, rough spirals of grey and brown, with little flecks of green. They don't look like much. To you they look like bait, but to these traders they're the raw gold of the coastline. Workers haul them from shallow waters, scraping them off rocks, prying them out of crevices. The sight is almost comical, grown men with muscles like ropes, bent over tide pools, muttering curses as slippery mollusks refuse to budge. It's strange to think that something so humble could fuel an empire's reputation. Yet the Phoenicians have always thrived on overlooked treasures. When the Egyptians wanted cedar beams for their sacred ships, who supplied them? When the Assyrians demanded tribute, who offered not just timber but shimmering glassware? And now, when distant nobles crave garments that scream wealth, who but the Phoenicians can provide cloth steeped in an unearthly purple? You imagine the hierarchy here. At the top, wealthy merchants counting coins, negotiating contracts, sipping wine that probably tastes like seawater. In the middle ship, captains barking orders, their tans as permanent as the ropes in their hands. At the bottom, laborers dragging baskets of snails, each one smelling like low tide mixed with despair. And somewhere in between, artisans with stained hands and eyes red from smoke experimenting with recipes no one fully understands. Historians still argue whether these workshops were family secrets passed from father to son or closely guarded state monopolies. Either way, the dye's reputation grows like wildfire, spreading faster than the smell it leaves behind. And oh, that smell! Even now, as you stroll past a dye workshop tucked behind the main street, your nose wrinkles. It's the odor of something halfway between rotting fish and unwashed socks left in the sun. Children dart past, holding their breath, laughing as if the stench is just part of daily life. You realize they've grown up with this. To them, purple dye isn't exotic. It's just another job, another smell that clings to the stones. Still, there's a sense of pride in the air. To live in Tyre or Sidon is to know that your city has a secret recipe, a power no other people can match. You might not wear the purple yourself, you'd have to sell your house, your goats, and probably your children to afford it, but you know that kings bow to it. And in a way that makes you important too. You're from the land where purple is born. As you lean against the pier, watching a ship push out to sea with its sail swelling like a giant's lung, you realize that everything in this place converges on two things, the sea and the color it hides. One gives the Phoenicians their reach, the other gives them their mystique. And both are about to get a lot messier when those baskets of snails meet the workers' knives. The baskets are heavier than you expect, their woven reeds groaning as men stagger up the stone steps from the shoreline. You trail behind them, and the closer you get, the more you notice how ordinary these shells appear. No glimmer, no sparkle, no halo of mystical light, just rough spirals mottled with barnacles dripping seawater onto the ground, as though the sea itself is reluctant to let them go. The workers dump the load in front of a low building that looks less like a workshop and more like a dungeon for unlucky mollusks. A pile of shells clatters to the ground. The air fills with that unmistakable smell, a sour mix of saltfish and decay that makes you tug your cloak over your nose. One man laughs at you, waving his hand as if to say, "You'll get used to it." You sincerely hope you won't. The process begins simply enough. Crack the shell, pull out the snail. It should be straightforward, but the sound alone is enough to make your skin crawl. Snap, crunch, crack. The workers use small hammers and knives, breaking open each shell with the precision of someone who's done it thousands of times. Out slides the slimy inhabitant, a pale, writhing mass that looks more like spilled porridge than treasure. Children gather at the edge of the yard, giggling at the sight, and one daring boy pokes a snail with a stick, earning a cuff from his mother. You bend closer and notice that not all of the snail is useful. The workers target a tiny gland buried deep inside, barely the size of a grain of rice. That's where the magic lives, or at least that's what the artisans believe. They toss the rest aside, the shells piling up like gravel, the bodies dumped into pits that buzz with flies. By midday, the ground is littered with shards, and your sandals crunch over them like walking on broken pottery. Here's where it gets curious. When they first extract that little gland, it doesn't glow purple. It looks pale, almost translucent, like the world's least appetizing jelly. If you smear it on cloth immediately, it leaves only a faint stain, more yellow than purple. It seems almost disappointing, like opening a treasure chest to find it filled with sand. Historians still argue whether the first discoverers saw potential right away, or whether generations of trial and error were needed before anyone realized what sunlight and time could coax from this slimy mess. The scene is part gruesome, part comic. A worker wipes his brow with the back of his hand, forgetting it's covered in goo, and now his forehead glistens with snail slime. His companion laughs so hard he drops his own shell, and the snail inside wriggles indignantly toward freedom. For a moment you almost root for the snail, the tiny rebel making its desperate dash. But alas, one swift stomp ends its journey. You can't help noticing the sheer scale of waste. Hundreds of snails for a thread, thousands for a single garment. No wonder only the richest of the rich will ever wear this dye. You imagine an ordinary farmer, his tunic faded and patched, walking past a noble, dressed in deep purple robes worth more than a barn full of oxen. The farmer mutters, "All that just from snails," and shakes his head. The workshop hums with rhythm. Crack, scrape, toss, crack, scrape, toss. The men work like clockwork, their hands moving faster than thought, their faces hardened against the smell. A donkey brays outside, sounding as if it disapproves of the entire enterprise. Overhead, gulls circle, emboldened by the piles of discarded meat, swooping low to snatch morsels before the workers chase them off with curses. There's an almost ritualistic quality to the labor. The Phoenicians may not frame it as sacred, but you sense a deep respect for this messy alchemy. To take something so ugly, so foul, and transform it into beauty, that's a kind of magic, even if it smells like a dumpster at low tide. You can imagine a priest blessing the baskets before they're cracked open, or a sailor rubbing a smear of snail goo on his tunic as a charm against bad luck. Historians still argue whether the dyeing process had religious overtones or whether it was simply a trade craft like glassblowing or carpentry. By the end of the day, your nose has grown numb, your eyes water, and your ears still ring with the sound of cracking shells. The workers sweep the shards into heaps taller than you are. Those heaps will one day form literal mounds outside Phoenician cities, great purple-smelling hills of shell waste that survive for centuries long after the dye industry itself fades away. Travelers will stumble across them and wonder what kind of people lived here to leave behind mountains of broken snail homes. For now, though, you step back into the cooler evening air, relieved for a moment of silence. Behind you, the workers laugh and slap each other's backs, proud of another day's haul. To them, this is routine. To you, it's a glimpse into a bizarre economy where value is hidden in slime and power begins with a cracked shell. Tomorrow, the real stench begins because those slimy glands aren't ready yet. They need time to rot, to ferment, to unlock their hidden fire. The next morning, you wake before dawn, but the stench is already there, rolling in like a fog. It clings to your clothes, your hair, even your tongue, as if the whole city has been swallowed by a gigantic fish market gone terribly wrong. You follow the workers back to the dye yards where yesterday's snail glands have been piled into clay vats. The vats sit uncovered beneath the relentless sun, their contents bubbling faintly, like some witch's brew that no sane person would dare to stir. This is the step that makes or breaks the dye. The glands must ferment, must stew in their own juices until the color hidden inside them begins to awaken. The irony. At this stage, there is nothing royal about it. You peer over the edge of a vat and instantly regret it. The surface is a slimy mosaic of browns and yellows buzzing with flies. The smell hits you like a physical blow, stronger, sharper than anything you've endured so far. You pull back, gagging, and a worker chuckles, patting you on the shoulder as if to say, first-timers always struggle. Historians still argue about the exact recipe. Some say the glands had to be salted, others claim they were simply left in brine. A few even suggest they were crushed alive, mixed with urine and boiled, yes boiled, until the liquid turned the right shade. You're not sure which version is worse, but either way it's clear this is not the sort of industry that leaves a neighborhood smelling like roses. And yet amid the horror, something fascinating is happening. As the days pass, the putrid piles transform. The liquid shifts from pale yellow to greenish, then to a murky blue. At first it seems random, like watching mold grow on old bread, but slowly, almost shyly, hints of violet creep in, deepening with each hour of exposure to the sun. By the third or fourth day, the vats are no longer just pits of sludge, they're portals to a hidden spectrum. One worker dips a scrap of wool into the mess and lifts it out. At first it looks disappointing, just another dull smear like someone spilled broth on a napkin. But then, as it dries in the light, you see it change. The yellowish stain darkens, deepens, blooms into a purple so vivid it almost hums. You blink, wondering if your eyes are playing tricks again, but no, it's real. The snail slime has surrendered its secret. The transformation is mesmerizing. You watch scrap after scrap emerge, each one carrying that same muted magic. Even the workers, hardened to the smell, pause to admire the shift. They joke about it, calling the process making gold out of garbage. And maybe that's not far from the truth. You start to understand why rulers would pay absurd sums for cloth dyed this way. It isn't just rare, it's miraculous. It's proof that beauty can crawl out of rot, that splendor can rise from slime. Still, not everyone is impressed. A fisherman passing by wrinkles his nose and mutters, "Purple cloth. Who cares as long as my nets catch fish?" His wife agrees, dragging him along before he can complain further. To ordinary folk, this is a business for the wealthy, a luxury for people who can afford to ignore the smell because someone else does the dirty work. For the rest, it's just another sign that the world is unfair. The fermenting continues and you find yourself oddly hypnotized by the cycle of decay. The vats bubble, the scraps dry, the color deepens. You notice the workers' hands are permanently stained, their fingernails tinted a dull purple, that no amount of scrubbing can remove. Maybe you think that was the original advertisement. Imagine a Phoenician sailor flashing his purple-streaked hands in a foreign port saying, "See this, only Tyre can give you this." Forget billboards, the stains were the brand. A fringe tale drifts through your mind. One legend claims that Hercules' dog discovered Tyrian purple, first biting into a snail on the beach and staining its muzzle. The goddess admired the color and demanded a robe of it, sparking the industry. You smile at the image, a drooling dog wagging its tail, oblivious that it just launched one of the most lucrative trades in history. Historians still argue whether the legend has any basis in reality, but you secretly hope it does. After all, who wouldn't want to believe a slobbery dog beat the Phoenicians to their greatest discovery? By evening, the vats are sealed again, the workers heading home with their clothes clinging to them like smoke. You trail behind, the smell still in your nose, but your mind focused on the transformation. Today you've seen death rot into beauty, foulness bloom into luxury. Tomorrow you'll see the next step, the moment when these scraps of dyed cloth leave the stink of the workshop behind and begin their journey into palaces and temples where no one dares to mention their humble, slimy origin. The morning breaks softer this time, the air tinged with smoke from bakeries instead of the stench of snails, though the memory clings to your senses like an unwanted guest. You follow a mule cart loaded with folded cloth scraps and strips that only yesterday were hanging damp and reeking over the dye vats. Now they are bundled neatly, the faint shimmer of purple peeking through like bruises beneath pale skin. The journey from workshop to palace is not glamorous. The mule clops over uneven stones past stalls where fishermen haggle past children, chasing each other through the dust. The driver swats lazily at flies, barely noticing the treasure he carries. To him it's just another delivery, no different than bringing grain or olive oil. Yet inside those bundles lies the fortune of a city. At the city gate, guards glance at the load with a mix of curiosity and envy. They know they'll never wear it, but they also know its worth. One guard leans over to sniff, wrinkles his nose, and waves the cart on quickly. You can almost hear him thinking, not worth smelling like that, no matter how rich it looks. By afternoon, you arrive at the governor's hall, a grand stone building with columns carved in spirals, their bases worn smooth by countless sandals. Inside, the air is cooler, perfumed with incense, to mask the faint odor seeping from the cloth. Servants lay the bundles before scribes who unfurl them carefully, their eyes widening at the transformation. Yesterday's scraps of slime-soaked wool are now deep rivers of purple, darker than wine, richer than sunset. The contrast is staggering. You recall the broken shells and buzzing flies of the workshop, and now here stands a nobleman draping the fabric across his shoulders, turning this once filthy product into a symbol of power. He studies himself in a polished bronze mirror, adjusting the folds so the light catches the fabric's sheen. Around him, courtiers murmur approval, their voices hushed, as if in the presence of something divine. Historians still argue whether the purple was reserved strictly for royalty in these early centuries, or whether wealthy merchants could also indulge. But one thing is clear, purple meant status. To wear it was to announce that you had wealth, to burn that your power was visible before you even spoke. In some places, the dye was worth more by weight than silver. Imagine a single robe costing more than an entire herd of cattle. That's the kind of absurdity purple carried on its shoulders. Servants scurry about, careful not to touch the fabric for too long, lest their own hands be stained. One whispers to another about how the color never fades, even after years in the sun. Another shakes her head, muttering that it must be cursed. How else could something so foul at its birth shine so beautifully now? You can't help but agree. It feels like the cloth itself carries a secret it refuses to tell. The nobleman finally sets aside the fabric, declaring it fit for tribute. Tomorrow a shipment will sail eastward, destined for a palace in Mesopotamia, or perhaps even Egypt. Already the scribes are busy tallying accounts, their reed pens scratching across papyrus as they note how much purple is owed, how many silver talents must be received in return. For them it's just numbers. For you it's the story of how a smelly little workshop on the coast feeds the desires of kings, Outside, the cart is reloaded, now lighter, but still carrying remnants of cloth. You walk alongside as it rolls toward the harbour. Ships stand ready, their sails furled, their decks buzzing with preparation. The captain of one vessel, his beard braided with tiny beads, inspects the purple cargo with pride. He knows this dye will open doors in foreign courts, that it will secure alliances and line his pockets with gold. The loading is almost ceremonial. Each bundle is wrapped tightly sealed with clay and carried aboard as if it were fragile pottery. Sailors joke about stealing a scrap for themselves, but none dare. The penalty for smuggling purple is harsh, for the city's wealth depends on guarding its monopoly. You glance at their hands, though, and see faint stains, proof that even they can't resist brushing against it, if only to claim a secret piece of glory. As the sun dips low, you watch the ship drift out of the harbour, its prow cutting the water with quiet determination. Behind you, the city smells of smoke salt and, yes, still a hint of snail. Ahead of that ship, though, lies admiration, envy, and power. You realize this is the great irony. The dye that stank up entire neighborhoods at its birth will, by the time it reaches distant palaces, be worshipped as a miracle. No one there will smell the snails, no one there will imagine the vats. They'll only see the color, and they'll only think of kings. You smile wryly at the thought. Tomorrow those kings will strut like peacocks, heavy robes dragging across marble floors, blissfully unaware that they're wrapped in the stink of yesterday's mollusks. The palace is buzzing tonight. Torches flicker along the walls, shadows dancing as servants scurry across polished floors of limestone. And there at the center of it all, a king or perhaps a high priest, depending on who tells the story, parades into the hall, draped in purple. You pause at the doorway, almost blinded by how different the fabric looks here. Under firelight it seems alive, rippling with shades that shift from violet to crimson to near black with every movement. You can tell the garment is heavy, weighed down not just by layers of cloth but by meaning. Every eye in the room locks onto it. This isn't just fashion, it's theatre. It's the king saying without words, "I own what you cannot touch." His courtiers wear linen wool, maybe a splash of blue from indigo or red from madder root, but none of it compares. Against his robe, their colours look washed out like chalk scribbles beside an oil painting. Historians still argue whether the association of purple with power began here in Phoenician lands or whether it was already brewing elsewhere. But in this hall at this moment you see why the idea stuck. Purple is expensive. Purple is rare. And human beings love nothing more than using rare things to prove they're important. The king doesn't just wear purple, he is purple, the living embodiment of scarcity turned into spectacle. You move closer, noting how the cloth falls in folds, how the light clings to it like honey. You can almost forget the snail stench now, though a faint trace lingers in your memory. The king gestures to his priests, who bow low, their own garments dyed with humbler hues. One of them whispers something about the robe being the color of eternity, and you smirk inwardly. Eternity probably smells better than that workshop you visited. Still, you sense the power here. The robe turns the man into more than human. To the crowd, he is a chosen figure marked by the gods through this strange, unearthly shade. There's even a superstition murmured in the corners that purple wards off evil spirits, that the gods themselves recognize the hue. You glance at the torches again, and sure enough, the fabric seems to glow as though it carries its own inner flame. Outside the hall, the story spreads. Merchants gossip about the price of purple climbing higher, how caravans have been robbed for just a few scraps of cloth, how entire villages could live off the value of one sleeve. Sailors boast that their city's kings are richer than Pharaoh because of this dye. Farmers grumble that their taxes vanish into nobles' wardrobes, and somewhere a child stares through the doorway, eyes wide, imagining what it would feel like to wear something so forbidden. A fringe tale circulates among the servants. One claims that wearing too much purple drives a man mad, that the color seeps into his mind, feeding him delusions of godhood. Another insists the opposite, that only the pure of heart can wear it without punishment. Neither tale is taken seriously, but both add to the mystique. And mystique, after all, is what makes purple more powerful than gold. You linger as the feast begins, Musicians pluck at lyres, dancers swirl trays of roasted lamb, and honey cakes are carried in. But all of it feels secondary. The purple robe remains the star of the evening, glowing even as wine spills and laughter grows rowdy. Guests lean closer to admire it, to run their fingers along the hem, if they dare. One man tries to joke about the smell better than my wife's cooking, and the room erupts in laughter. But beneath the humor lies awe. Everyone knows they are witnessing a symbol, something larger than themselves. And so the king drinks, laughs, commands all, while wrapped in the skin of snails dragged from the sea. You glance around the hall, noting how even those not wearing purple stand taller, prouder, simply by being in its presence. It's as if the whole court basks in reflected glory. As the torches burn lower and the night drifts on, you realize this is the moment the dye truly transforms. Not in the vats, not on the cloth, but here in the gaze of people who believe. The snails gave color, yes, but humans gave it meaning. And in that meaning, purple became power. You step back into the cool night stars pricking the sky above. The echoes of laughter fade, but the image of the robe lingers. Tomorrow you suspect the merchants will be busy again, the snails will be cracked open again, the vats will bubble again, and somewhere across the sea another king will dream of wrapping himself in this impossible shade. The road to the harbour is alive with noise, and you find yourself trailing behind another mule cart stacked high with bundles of newly dyed cloth. This time the smell is faint, masked by layers of cedar shavings and resin rubbed into the packaging. No one in the palace halls would ever guess how recently these shimmering bolts of purple fabric were hanging dripping and reeking in the dye yard. That's the secret. The stink is buried here while the glory sails away. Down at the docks the air brims with salt tar and voices shouting over each other. Sailors balance amphorae on their shoulders, merchants argue about weights and prices, scribes tally goods on wax tablets. The sea itself seems restless waves, slapping the hulls of ships as if urging them to hurry. Your eyes roam across the scene, catching glimpses of cedar planks stacked for trade baskets of olives, glass beads catching the sun, and among them the purple bundles being loaded with exaggerated care. You pause to watch a negotiation. A merchant from Cyprus squints at the fabric, rubbing it between his fingers as though he can measure its worth by touch alone. The Phoenician trader smiles slyly, naming a price that makes the foreigner cough into his beard. Yet the man doesn't walk away. He knows he can't. This is purple, there's no substitute, no alternative. He pays grumbling, but you can see the glint in his eyes. He knows he'll sell it for 10 times more once it reaches the court of some island chieftain. The ships creak as they take on the precious cargo. Sailors lash the bundles down, carefully shielding them from splashes of seawater. It feels ceremonial, almost sacred. One captain, tall and weather-beaten, touches the cloth before boarding, as if asking the dye itself for good fortune at sea. Perhaps it's a superstition, perhaps just habit, but you notice the younger sailors mimic him, palm against purple, eyes closed briefly before they go to work. Historians still argue whether the dye trade was controlled by state monopolies or whether merchants acted independently, but here at the docks it looks like both. The city guards watch closely, ensuring no scrap goes missing, while private traders haggle over prices with wide grins. Everyone understands the stakes. If cedar wood is valuable, if glass beads are desirable, then purple is untouchable. It is not just merchandise, it is leverage. You wander farther down the quay, where smaller boats wait to ferry goods to larger ships anchored offshore. Sailors sit on coils of rope, chewing dried figs and joking about how purple robes make men strut like roosters. One laughs, "Maybe I'll steal a scrap and tie it around my donkey, make him king of the street." Another shouts back, "Careful, the donkey might start taxing you for hay." The laughter echoes, but beneath it lies a real truth. Purple has become so tied to power that even animals draped in it would look important. As the sun climbs higher, you see the fleet preparing to leave. Sails are unfurled ropes, cast off the rhythmic slap of oars joins the soundscape. You imagine the journey ahead across the Mediterranean, where each port will treat the purple cloth as if it were holy relics. In Egypt, priests may drape it on statues of gods. In Anatolia, kings may stitch it into ceremonial cloaks. In Greece, poets may describe it as the very blood of the sea. The dye leaves its birthplace but never its aura. There's a strange satisfaction in watching it go. You remember the cracked shells, the fermenting vats, the unbearable smell. And now here it is, bound for palaces where nobles will never smell. The snails never imagine the labourers with purple-stained hands. They'll only see glory. That's the final alchemy, turning disgust into desire, decay into dignity. The last ship pushes off its oars, dipping in perfect rhythm. The crowd thins, merchants heading home. With full purses, workers trudging back toward the dye yards for tomorrow's harvest. You stay at the dock a little longer, breathing in the salt air, trying to cleanse your senses of everything else. The purple is gone now, carried over the horizon. But its influence lingers. You can almost hear it, a whisper, carried on the waves, power stitched into fabric, authority dyed into thread. And somewhere far from here, another ruler is waiting impatient for his own chance to drape himself in the impossible colour that began with snails refusing to shine. You find yourself in a hall larger than any Phoenician workshop, far from the reek of rotting snails. Marble pillars rise like frozen waterfalls, polished floors gleam beneath torchlight, and every eye in the chamber is drawn to one man. The king strides forward, wrapped in purple. His robe billows with every step, heavy folds whispering against the stone, as though the cloth itself wants to remind everyone it exists. The crowd parts instinctively. Purple has that effect, it announces authority before the king even opens his mouth. You notice how the courtiers bow lower than usual, how foreign envoys stiffen their eyes, flicking to the robe with envy. It's not just fabric anymore, it's a declaration. I command seas, I command men, I command wealth enough to stain myself in snails you will never afford. Historians still argue about when exactly purple became the colour of exclusivity, whether it started here or later under Roman decree. But tonight in this chamber, it's obvious. No other hue carries this weight. Scarlet may scream of war, white may whisper of purity, but purple rules. The robe itself is a marvel. You step closer, careful not to intrude, and watch how torchlight plays on the folds. In one moment it looks nearly black, swallowing the firelight whole. In another it glows with deep crimson, as if the fabric bleeds from within. Courtiers murmur that the colour resembles the wine of the gods, the dawn sky, even the blood of heroes. You smirk at the exaggeration, but deep down you admit they aren't entirely wrong. There's an air of performance to the whole evening. When the king lifts his goblet, the purple sleeve drapes forward, commanding attention as much as his words. When he gestures to musicians, the robe flares like a flag. You wonder if the king knows that his greatest speech tonight is not spoken, but worn. Not everyone is impressed, though. In a corner, you overhear a grizzled soldier muttering, "A robe won't win battles. Give me iron, not colours." His companion hushes him. Quickly dangerous words in a hall where symbols matter more than swords. Yet you find the comment refreshing. After all, what is purple but cloth? It can't feed an army, it can't build ships, but it can bend men's perceptions, and sometimes that's enough to tilt the world. You recall a fringe story whispered by merchants. One prince bankrupted his treasury just to outfit his court in purple, only to find himself overthrown within the year. The colour dazzled, yes, but it could not buy loyalty. Was it true? Historians still argue, but the tale lingers a warning that symbols can't replace substance. The banquet begins. Musicians pluck lyres, dancers twirl platters of roasted birds, arrive, their skins glistening with honey glaze. Yet none of it holds the room's gaze the way the robe does. Servants bow lower when they refill the king's goblet. Nobles angle themselves closer to catch the purple in the firelight. Poets compose verses under their breath, desperate to immortalize the sight. You watch as foreign envoys whisper among themselves. They'll return home describing the robe as much as the policies discussed tonight. They'll say, "We saw a king cloaked in the sea's own blood. in the color no coin can buy. And back in their courts, their own rulers will grind their teeth wanting the same, plotting how to acquire it. The night stretches on, the king laughs loudly, his purple sleeves brushing the table, his jewels catching the torchlight. To the crowd he looks eternal, untouchable, but you can't help remembering the dye yard, the cracked shells, the fermenting vats, the buzzing flies. It's almost comical, this transformation. The robe may shine like starlight, but deep down it's still born of slime. That's the secret, though. Well, no one here wants to think about the origin. They want the myth, not the truth. And so purple remains a cloak, not just of fabric, but of illusion. It hides the labor, the stink, the waste, and leaves only awe. You step outside into the cool night, the echoes of music fading. Behind you, kings and courtiers revel in their borrowed majesty. Ahead of you, the sea waits dark and silent, ready to deliver more snails, more shells, more stink to feed the endless hunger for purple. You wake the next morning, not to torches and trumpets, but to the creak of abacuses and the scratch of styluses across wax tablets. The dye has left the workshops, the robe has dazzled the banquet, and now you find yourself in the quieter, less glamorous corner of the purple trade, the counting room. Merchants sit cross-legged on matte scrolls unfurled before them. The air smells less of snails and more of cedar ink and beeswax candles. A clerk reads out numbers, his voice flat, while another tallies in the margin. 1 bolt, 3 shekels, another bolt 5, transport 2. You almost drift off just listening until you realize the sums are staggering. Purple is moving like silver, like gold. Sometimes it's valued higher. One merchant grins as he slaps a fellow trader on the back. A week in the dye yard, a month at sea, and now look. He spreads his hands dramatically as if displaying invisible riches, all from creatures smaller than a coin. His friend chuckles, though you notice the way he pockets his profits quickly. Lips tight, eyes darting toward the guards posted at the door. Everyone knows wealth draws envy, and envy can draw blades. Historians still argue whether Phoenician merchants deliberately inflated purple's rarity or whether the snails truly were that scarce. Either way, the numbers tell the same story. The less of it available, the more kings would pay. You picture some ruler demanding purple for his coronation, no matter the cost, while merchants sit in back rooms like this, smirking over ledgers, counting coin after coin. You wander to the market square where some of these profits circulate. Jewelers display necklaces heavy with amber potters, line up amphorae painted with dolphins. Spice sellers tempt passers-by with cinnamon and saffron. It's bustling, colorful, loud. Yet the loudest whispers are still about purple. Did you hear, one woman says, leaning toward her neighbor? The Sidonian traders brought cloth worth more than a vineyard. Another man shakes his head. Not just more, worth 10 vineyards. The numbers keep stretching, the value inflating with each retelling, until purple seems less a commodity and more a miracle. You linger by a group of sailors gambling with knucklebones. One flips a coin and mutters, "I could work a lifetime and never afford a cuff of that fabric." His companion snorts. "Even if you could, what then? People would assume you stole it. Better to stay in plain linen." You smile at the irony, a color so precious it becomes dangerous to own unless you already wield power. Purple is profit, yes, but it's also a trap. In a dim tavern near the docks you overhear merchants spinning tales to impress. One swears a single robe bought him a villa on Cyprus. Another insists purple cloth has been traded for entire fleets of ships. Are these true? Maybe, maybe not. Historians still argue whether such exchanges ever happened, or whether they're just legends merchants like to brag about over wine. Still, as the jug empties and the voices grow louder, the stories blur into something believable. After all, you've seen the numbers in the ledger. Why not a villa? Why not a fleet? Yet behind the wealth lies anxiety. A merchant sits alone in the corner, running his thumb along the rim of his goblet. He mutters about storms at sea, about bandits on the road, about rival cities undercutting prices. You realize purple may make men rich, but it also makes them nervous. Every coin is a risk, every bolt of fabric a gamble, and if a shipment sinks beneath the waves, gone. Just like that, fortunes dissolve. Back in the counting room, the merchants gather again. They argue over how much to reinvest, how much to hoard. Some want to expand workshops, hire more laborers to smash more shells. Others warn against overproduction. Flood the market, and the kings won't pay as much. Their debate grows heated until the head clerk slams his stylus down. Enough. The dye is valuable because we control it. Remember that. Lose control, lose the purple. You leave them to their sums, stepping outside into the late afternoon. The harbour gleams with coins changing hands. The market hums with trade, but you can't shake the thought purple is more than wealth. It's a performance, a balancing act between scarcity and desire. Merchants grow fat on it, yes, but they also walk a knife's edge. As you drift toward the waterfront, you picture the bolts of fabric on some ship's deck, sunlight warming the bundles, profit hidden beneath cedar shavings. Gold may glitter in the open, but purple travels wrapped, guarded, secretive. And still, no matter how carefully it's hidden, everyone knows it's there, the silent treasure that turns snails into silver slime, into fortune. By now, you've trudged through dye yards, feasted in palaces, and sat in counting rooms. And yet one question keeps gnawing at you: where did it all really begin? As the evening cools, you join a group of scholars lounging beneath a colonnade, their clay cups filled with watered wine, their conversation circling endlessly around that one unsolved riddle who first cracked open a snail and thought, "Yes, let's smear this on cloth." One scholar gestures dramatically toward the sea. "It was Tyre," he insists, "the city of kings, the birthplace of our dye and the only true heart of purple." He swirls his cup as if the wine inside could prove his point. Another scholar scoffs, "Nonsense. Everyone knows Sidon had workshops before Tyre even had walls. Their harbours smelled of dye long before Tyre was more than a fisherman's camp." A third leans in, whispering conspiratorially, "And what of Crete? The Minoans painted walls with colours no one else possessed." Historians still argue whether their palettes included early purple. Perhaps they discovered the trick, and the Phoenicians only perfected it later. The debate goes round and round, each man citing half-remembered tablets, fragmentary inscriptions, vague oral traditions. The truth is slippery, like trying to grab a fish bare-handed. You can't help but chuckle. Here are learned men with scrolls stacked high, and yet not one can point to the exact moment when purple was born. Then someone raises the myth. You've heard it before, the story of the god Melkart walking along the shore with his lover. A dog bites into a snail, staining its mouth purple. The lover demands a cloak in that same color, and thus the dye is discovered. It's charming, romantic, and utterly unbelievable. Yet the scholars nod solemnly, debating which beach the divine dog might have trotted upon. You slip away from their circle, amused. Myths are easier than facts. Myths give neat beginnings, heroes and gods, while history offers only broken shells and smelly pits. Still, you admit the myth captures something true. The dye's discovery was an accident, a spark struck in the dark, impossible to repeat with intention, until someone noticed and tried again. Down at the harbour, you eavesdrop on sailors boasting to foreign visitors. One swears his grandfather was there when the first vat was stirred in Tyre. Another insists his family in Sidon dyed cloth centuries earlier. The visitors just nod politely, perhaps planning to repeat whichever version flatters their hosts when they return home. You realize the debate isn't just about history, it's about pride, reputation, and control of the narrative. If your city claims the origin, your city owns the prestige. Quirky tales crop up too. One fisherman mutters that the dye was first spotted when fishermen used snail guts as bait, and one careless throw stained the hem of a tunic. Another claims it was children smashing shells on rocks chasing the weird smell. Are these likely? Maybe not, but they sound almost more believable than divine dogs and jealous gods. You reflect on how fragile origins are. The first Phoenician who noticed a smear of purple could never have guessed it would shape kingship, wealth, and identity for centuries. And yet here you are, centuries later, watching grown men squabble over which shoreline deserves the credit. Historians still argue whether it even matters. Wasn't the true genius not the first discovery, but the system that turned chance into industry? After all, you've seen the workshops, the trade, the counting houses. Snails alone don't make purple, organization does. Perhaps the better question is not who found it first, but who controlled it longest. As night falls, you sit on the seawall, the waves brushing against stone. You picture Tyre-Sidon Crete, all glowing faintly across the horizon, each claiming to be the cradle of purple. Maybe they all were, maybe none were. The debate will never end, and maybe that's the point. The uncertainty keeps the story alive, whispered in courts, argued in taverns, scribbled in margins of half-burned scrolls. You lean back, watching the stars emerge one by one. The die may have no single birthplace, no neat origin story, but its mystery is part of its magic. And that magic still clings to every thread of cloth that sails away from these harbors, destined to wrap kings in colors born from arguments and accidents. You wander into a scriptorium, the air thick with the smell of parchment and the faint scratch of reeds on papyrus. Here, far from dye vats and merchant stalls, the story of purple takes on a quieter shape. Monks and scribes bend over their desks, copying recipes, scribbling marginal notes, trying to capture the knowledge of an art already half lost. One scroll lies open before you, filled with neat columns of text. It describes, in clipped phrases, the steps you've seen with your own eyes. Smash the snail, let it rot. Stir it in brine, watch the color bloom. But the instructions are vague, frustratingly so. No amounts are given. No times are recorded. Leave in the sun until ready. One line reads, "Until ready, ready for what you shake your head." If you tried this at home, you'd end up with a bucket of stink and nothing more. Historians still argue whether this vagueness was intentional, a way of protecting secrets, or whether scribes simply didn't understand what they were writing down. After all, many of them were recording words they'd never put into practice. Imagine trying to describe baking bread without ever tasting flour. That's what these recipes feel like, shadows of a craft too complex to capture on parchment, and yet scattered among the vague instructions you find quirky notes. One margin says, "The dye changes color under the moon." Another warns, "Do not breathe too close, lest the spirit of the snail enter you." You can't help but chuckle. Whether these were superstitions, jokes, or mistranslations, they reveal something deeply human. Even scribes had no idea what made the process work. Some scrolls claim you must bury the snails in clay jars for days. Others say you should leave them on rooftops under the sun. A few suggest mixing in honey wine or even urine. You imagine workshops turning into kitchens of alchemy, each dyer, swearing his grandmother's recipe, produced the truest shade. The truth, no one knows anymore. Modern chemists can replicate the dye, yes, but the exact Phoenician methods remain slippery, cloaked in mystery and lost detail. As you read, you picture an apprentice centuries ago hunched over a vat, sniffing, stirring, waiting for some miraculous shift of color. Perhaps he thought he'd ruined the batch, only to watch it transform overnight into deep violet. You picture another apprentice failing, entirely punished for wasting snails, left to wonder which forgotten step he missed. Knowledge passed unevenly like whispers in the dark, always at risk of distortion, and so the recipes became half riddles, half relics. One tablet from Ugarit lists ingredients, but ends abruptly as though the writer grew tired or secretive. Another fragment from Egypt describes the juice of seashells, but confuses it with pigment for painting walls, not cloth. Scholars today piece these shards together, still debating what was lost, what was hidden, and what was simply never written down. You glance up at the scribes around you. They copy diligently, eyes, narrowed hands, steady. But you notice how some of them smile faintly, as if aware their work is more theatre than science. They preserve words, yes, but words that drift further from reality with each generation. The dye process is alive in the workshops, in the stink and sweat, not in these tidy lines of ink. And once the workshops vanish, the recipes alone will never be enough to bring it back. It strikes you that this is the paradox of purple, a trade built on secrecy and skill so fragile it could vanish with a single broken chain of apprentices. And yet here in these manuscripts, the illusion of permanence persists. Recipes, half-true notes, half-believed knowledge, half-kept. Enough to tantalize, never enough to recreate. As the lamps burn lower, you let your eyes wander across the room. Shelves sag under the weight of scrolls, some already cracking with age. You wonder how many centuries these words will last. How many curious readers will puzzle over the same vague phrases? How many more debates will ignite from the lack of clarity? And maybe that's fitting. Purple was always about mystery, about the unseen labor behind the shine. Why should its recipes be any different? The dye refuses to yield its secrets fully, just as the snails refused to shine until forced. Perhaps that stubbornness is the truest legacy of all. You step out of the scriptorium and into a bazaar that feels almost theatrical. Bright awnings stretch overhead. Voices rise in layered pitches, and every stall competes for attention. But beneath the cacophony you sense a theme: imitation. Not everyone can afford snail-born purple, but everyone wants it, and so copycats thrive. You stroll past one stall where bolts of cloth shimmer faintly in the sun. The merchant beams, spreading his arms wide. See here, the very color of kings. You lean closer. It's close, yes, but not quite. The shade is too even, too flat. Real snail dye changes with the light, crimson one moment, violet the next, almost alive. This cloth looks painted static, as if trapped in a single hue. The merchant notices your hesitation. He lowers his voice. Cheaper though, half the price. Who will know? Historians still argue whether these imitations came from natural dyes like madder and indigo cleverly blended, or whether some workshops experimented with minerals and plant extracts. What's clear is that counterfeits were rampant. You picture nobles squinting at their robes, wondering if their cloth truly carried the sea's essence, or just clever weeds. One quirky tidbit you overhear from a spice vendor makes you laugh. Some fakes were so poorly made, they ran in the rain. Imagine a court procession interrupted by a sudden shower and the royal robe bleeding red streaks down the steps. The image is absurd, but entirely possible. Still, many imitations were convincing enough to fool. You watch as a group of young aristocrats, too poor for true purple, but too proud for plain linen bargain over a bundle of dyed wool. They whisper, nervously glancing around as if ashamed. In this world, fakes are not just cheaper, they're dangerous. Wearing counterfeit purple might elevate you, but if discovered, it could ruin you. There's a strange intimacy in this pursuit of the impossible shade. Ordinary citizens smear berries on their tunics, children stain cloth with flowers, hoping to glimpse even a shadow of the royal glow. One old woman tells you she boils lichens for days just to produce a pale lavender she insists is close enough. Her neighbors tease her, but you see the pride in her eyes. She can't afford Phoenician silk, but she carries her own kingdom in her shawl. And yet the true merchants of purple sneer at these efforts. To them, imitations threaten profits. They lobby rulers to regulate dye, to outlaw counterfeits, to enforce purple as a monopoly. In Rome, centuries later, laws will even dictate who can wear the color, an attempt to keep fakes from flooding the streets. But for now, here in the marketplace, the struggle plays out stall by stall. You notice how quickly rumors spread. One man whispers that a rival city discovered a plant-based dye equal to Tyrian purple. Another insists glassmakers have learned to tint fabric with powdered minerals. None of it holds up, but the whispers alone spark unease. If purple can be replicated cheaply, what happens to its aura of exclusivity? As you wander deeper into the market, you find a workshop openly advertising near purple. The dyer waves you inside, showing vats of bubbling indigo mixed with something pungent. Not the same, he admits with a shrug, but it lasts and it doesn't stink. He grins. Besides, kings won't shop here, only you and me. You run your fingers over the cloth he offers. It's pretty. Rich blue tinged with violet durable. It lacks the flickering fire of snail purple, but it has its own charm. You imagine ordinary families buying this cloth, wearing it proudly, not as counterfeit, but as defiance. Why should color belong only to kings? The sun lowers, casting the bazaar in bronze light. You realize that imitation is part of purple's story, not a footnote, but a constant shadow. The real and the fake chase each other endlessly, each giving the other meaning. Without forgeries, true purple would not gleam so brightly. Without exclusivity, no one would bother faking it. And as you leave the market, the echo of bargaining voices behind you, you sense that this struggle, the desire to mimic greatness, the fear of being exposed will ripple far into the future. For as long as humans crave status stitched into cloth, there will be those who make it real and those who make it close enough. The market fades behind you and the world shifts. You are no longer in the bright stalls of Tyre or Sidon, but walking along a crumbling Roman road. The stones beneath your feet are cracked weeds pushing through the gaps. The empire that once roared across continents is quiet now, its legions scattered, its cities sacked, and with the empire's decline, purple begins to fade too. You pass what used to be a grand workshop. Its walls are still streaked with stains, purple shadows clinging like ghosts, but the vats are empty, the roof partly collapsed. A few children play nearby, tossing snail shells like marbles, unaware that their ancestors once turned those shells into gold. Historians still argue whether Rome's fall directly caused the dye industry's collapse or whether new trade routes and fashions simply shifted demand. But here, standing in the silence, it feels obvious. Without emperors to command exclusivity, without vast treasuries to bankroll the stink of snail vats, purple loses its crown. You imagine a Roman senator in the twilight years, still strutting in his purple-edged toga, while the streets outside crumble. The robe might glow, but the world it symbolized is already gone. What good is a kingly hue when the kingdom itself is ashes? Yet purple lingers in strange ways. Quirky tidbits: some late Roman rulers tried to recycle old robes, cutting them apart, re-dyeing them, stitching fragments into new garments. Picture an emperor draped in patchwork purple, pretending his robe still screams power, when in truth it whispers desperation. Merchants, once so proud, now struggle to sell their bolts of cloth. Without Rome's appetite, the market shrinks. Some turn to other trades, glass-making, cedarwood export, simple textiles. The dye yards rust quietly, the sea still coughs up snails, but fewer men bother collecting them. Who will pay? Who cares anymore? You wander into a town square where a tattered purple banner still flaps weakly. It hangs from a leaning pole, ignored by the crowd. A man selling onions props his stall beneath it, not even glancing up. Purple, once untouchable, is now background decoration. It's unsettling, almost sad, like watching a retired gladiator performing tricks in a marketplace. Historians still argue whether the Byzantines preserved true Tyrian purple, or whether their so-called imperial purple was already a substitute by then. What's clear is that the dye never vanished completely. It just shrank, pulled inward, clung to pockets of power. A handful of emperors, bishops and generals still demanded it, but the aura was thinner now, the monopoly weaker. You pass an old merchant hunched on a stool. His beard is long, his robe plain, but his eyes carry memory. "I traded purple in the days of glory," he mutters. "Ships loaded with it, palaces gleaming with it, and now nothing but weeds in the vats." He chuckles bitterly. Funny thing though, the stink has gone, but I almost miss it. You realize the decline is not just economic, but sensory. Entire cities once reeked of dye, the air heavy with rotting shells. Now the air is fresher, cleaner, but it feels emptier too. Purple's absence is a silence you can smell. As night falls, you walk past ruins glowing faintly in moonlight. Purple, once the fire of kings, has dimmed to embers. It isn't gone, not entirely, but it is diminished, a relic of empires that no longer roar. And you wonder, is this how greatness always fades? Not in one dramatic moment, but in slow neglect until symbols turn to curiosities and treasures become trivia. The snails still crawl in the tide pools, refusing to shine, but no one is watching anymore. The road of ruins fades behind you, and now you wander into the hushed stone halls of a medieval monastery. Candles flicker, casting amber halos on walls where monks bend over parchment, their quills scratching out gospels. Outside, the world may be chaotic wars, famine kingdoms rising and falling, But here time drips slower measured in chants and prayers. And yet even in this cloistered silence, purple lingers. A monk lifts a finished manuscript, its pages glowing with intricate illuminations. Gold leaf glitters, crimson borders burn bright, and at the center, letters shimmer with a deep, dark violet ink. You lean closer. It is not snail purple, not truly, but a concoction brewed from lichens and wine meant to mimic the hue of kings. In the absence of empires, purple has found refuge in scripture. Historians still argue whether some medieval manuscripts contain traces of true Tyrian dye or whether every example is substitution. Testing fragments has revealed both sometimes snail-born pigment, sometimes clever forgeries. Either way, the point remains purple still signified holiness, majesty, otherworldly importance. The robe of kings had become the ink of God. You picture a scribe laboring for weeks over a single page, dipping his quill into a tiny vial, rationing each drop of purple. To him, the color was not for robes or banquets, but for eternity, words meant to outlast kingdoms. The irony is thick. What emperors once wore into halls of power now glows silently in books read only by monks. A quirky story spreads among these cloisters. One abbey supposedly kept a single square of ancient purple cloth said to have belonged to Constantine himself. Monks would bring it out on feast days, draping it across the altar. Whether it was real or just dyed wool hardly mattered. Pilgrims wept at the sight, convinced they were gazing upon a fragment of empire stitched into faith. You step outside where stained glass windows scatter violet light across the floor. The color feels different now, gentler. No longer the glare of royalty, but the hush of reverence. Purple has shifted roles from power to piety, from court to cloister. It survives, yes, but as a ghost of its former self. Still in marketplaces beyond the monastery walls, whispers about purple persist. Traveling merchants brag about rare bolts of cloth smuggled from Byzantium or counterfeit dyes brewed in hidden vats. Rulers who can afford it still wrap themselves in the shade, though fewer each century. The aura is diluted but not gone. Historians still argue whether medieval Europe ever truly lost the recipe for snail purple or simply chose cheaper substitutes. Either way, its mystique deepened. What was once common in palaces became rare even in dreams, and so the color turned legendary, half memory, half miracle. You watch the monks file into the chapel for evening prayers, their plain wool robes brushing against the stone floor. No purple adorns their bodies, only their books. And yet, as their voices rise in chant, the stained glass above them glows violet, painting them in the very hue they deny themselves. It's as if the color refuses to vanish completely, slipping through cracks of history to linger in unexpected places. The bells toll, the chants fade, and night settles over the monastery. You realize that purple has endured not just through kings or merchants, but through these quiet keepers of memory. Without them, even the idea of purple might have slipped away. As you leave, you glance back at the candlelit windows, their violet light dimming with distance. Purple is no longer empire, no longer wealth, but it remains hidden, subtle, waiting. A whisper of the past echoing into the present. The monastery bells fade into silence, and you find yourself drifting forward into the softest chapter yet. No more bustling harbors, no more kings or merchants, just you, the night, and the lingering shadow of purple. It has carried you across centuries, through stink and splendor, and now it settles into your own quiet. You imagine lying beneath a sky, slowly deepening from indigo to black. The stars scatter above each one, a pinprick of ancient light, but between them the heavens shimmer with the faintest purple haze. It's not royal, not sacred, not for sale. It's simply there, vast and calm, waiting for you to notice. Purple has always been a trickster color, born from creatures that refused to shine, nurtured in vats that stank worse than rot, and yet somehow transformed into the emblem of majesty. You smile because you've seen the joke behind it all. The kings in their robes, the merchants with their coins, the monks with their manuscripts, all of them leaning on a shade that began as slime. And maybe that's the point. Majesty often has mud in its roots. Historians still argue whether this dye was ever as rare as the legends claim, whether scarcity was truth or carefully staged illusion. But lying here in your imagination, you realize it hardly matters. Belief turned purple into power. Desire wove snails into thrones. And in the end, stories have stained the fabric of history more deeply than any vat of dye. A quirky echo tickles you, the thought of some child on a Phoenician shore, smashing shells with a stick, laughing at the mess, never realizing he was holding the spark of empires. That child's laughter still rings in the background of all the pomp and ceremony. You let the thought drift, the harbor smells fade, the banquet torches dim, the monastery chants hush, and all that remains is the sea itself, eternal whispering against rocks where snails still crawl unaware of the roles they once played. They do not shine, they never did, and yet in their refusal they created brilliance. Now in your own room, safe and warm, you let that irony soothe you. You don't need to chase thrones or riches. You don't need to carry purple on your shoulders. Tonight, you carry only quiet. Your breath slows. Your body sinks deeper into the mattress. The hum of the fan in the corner becomes your ocean, steady and endless. The story has walked you across ages, and now it lays you gently back where you began. Close your eyes, let the last strands of purple fade, not as a symbol of power or wealth, but as a soft veil wrapping your thoughts, pulling you into dreams. The snails are still crawling, the waves are still moving, and history keeps on humming. But for you, the night is still.
And maybe the only throne you need right now is the pillow beneath your head.
The room grows quieter, softer. Even the shadows seem to relax, stretching long and gentle across the walls. You take a deeper breath, noticing how the air feels cooler now, steady against your skin. Each inhale drifts slower, each exhale lingers longer. The story you've followed, the snails, the dye, the kings and monks, fades into a kind of background hum, no louder than the fan in the corner or the crickets outside your window. You let the details blur. No more sharp edges, no more counting shells or coins. Just the broad strokes of memory, purple waves at twilight robes trailing across stone floors, quiet pages turning beneath candlelight. They dissolve into a calm rhythm like waves rolling endlessly against the shore. Your body feels heavier now, comfortably so. The mattress holds you, the blanket tucks around you, and you realize there's nothing left to chase. No ships setting sail, no workshops buzzing with labor, no debates among scholars. Only stillness. If a thought rises, let it pass like a gull gliding overhead before vanishing back into the dark. If a worry lingers, let it soften, dissolving like dye in water, spreading thinner until it disappears. There is no need to hold on to anything. Tonight, you are the sea at rest, deep and quiet. The world turns, history stretches behind and ahead, but here in this moment, all is steady. Let your eyelids grow heavy, let the last threads of purple unwind into darkness. And as sleep takes you, imagine yourself floating in that colorless, calm, safe, timeless, endless. Good night.